truth. There are murderers out there running free because of Lucas.
The saga of Henry Lee Lucas began in the isolated backwoods of Virginia and would reveal just how vulnerable American justice can be to a lie so big it's accepted as the truth. He was born on August 23rd, 1936, and lived with his family in a primitive dirt floor log cabin in the Appalachians. His domineering mother, Viola, brewed moonshine and forced her kids to work on the still. Henry's father had lost both his legs in a railroad accident and was an alcoholic. At the age of 7, Henry lost his left eye when his brother accidentally struck him with a knife. After that, he wore a glass eye. As Henry grew older, he became angry and more withdrawn. He spent his teenage years in and out of jails and prison for crimes including burglary and car theft. When released from Virginia State Prison in the fall of 1959, the 23-year-old went to Michigan to live with his older sister in the small town of Tecumseh. He did not want to go back to live with his mother in Virginia. But soon, she followed him to Michigan. On the cold night of January 12, 1960, Henry and his mother went to drink at a bar in town.
And I was pretty well drunk when she started arguments and wanted me to go back home with her, trying to make me go back to Virginia to live with her. I told her I didn't want nothing to do with her.
And that's when she told him, if you don't go back with me, I'll see to it you spend the rest of your life in prison.
They kept arguing on the way back to the sister's home. In the upstairs bedroom, the fight turned violent. When it was over, Viola lay motionless on the floor. Lucas ran out of the house and skipped town. The next day, Henry's sister found her 74-year-old mother dead. She had died of a stab wound in her neck. Henry was the last person seen with his mother. A warrant was issued for his arrest. But Lucas was nowhere to be found. A few days later, he ended up in Toledo, Ohio.
I was picked up by a state trooper. He said I looked funny, you know, with a big heavy coat on, you know. He said, well, he just looks suspicious, you know.
When the trooper discovered there was a warrant out on Lucas, he arrested him and notified Michigan police. Under questioning, the suspect said that in the heat of the argument, quote, I hit her, and I had a knife in my hand, but I do not know if I got the pocket knife from my pocket or just had it in my hand. Lucas added that when his mother dropped to the floor, he realized that the knife blade was open and that he had seriously hurt her.
I don't think he knew what to do or where to go. Then his statement is that he stole the car and went to Virginia. Then he decided to come back. He claims that he did not know she was dead. He really was coming back, he claims, in effect to find out how she was.
Whether or not police believed that claim, Henry had confessed to stabbing Viola Lucas. The trial took place in March 1960 in the nearby town of Adrian. Since Lucas had confessed, the defense did not dispute that he had killed his mother. Instead, the issue at trial was whether Lucas was guilty of first-degree murder or manslaughter.
Henry got in an argument, and without any premeditation, without malice, without really intending to kill, he does it.
To make its case, the defense put on the stand Henry Lee Lucas himself. In court, the defendant calmly repeated the story he had told police. Though now, he couldn't even remember striking his mother with the knife. Lucas showed no sign of emotion or remorse that could soften the jury. His cold-blooded nature troubled his own attorney.
Henry told me he liked knives, and he told me that he used them to cut up animals. He cut up cats, he cut up rabbits. That was something that he seemed to think that was fun to do.
Still, the defense tried to evoke sympathy for Lucas, arguing that his perception of the world had been warped by his harsh upbringing. Henry and his sister Opal testified about growing up in Virginia amid poverty and abuse, and unveiled disturbing facts about their mother.
My mother was a prostitute. She sold herself for money, And I was made to watch her have sex. I hated her,
According to Lucas, his mother beat him up every chance she had.
I've got gashes in the back of my head. I've got black and blue marks on my body, from being beaten every day. If I didn't do something she wanted, I got beaten.
Lucas said that his mother abused him not just physically, but also emotionally.
She had wanted a daughter, so Henry, until the age of 6, was forced to dress in girls' clothes, and his mother grew his hair long and put it in curlers.
Although sympathetic to Lucas's troubled background, the jurors did not believe he killed his mother by accident. They reached a compromise verdict. Lucas was guilty of second-degree murder. The defendant showed no reaction to the verdict.
I don't think Henry ever worried about tomorrow. Yeah, he didn't want to go to jail. He didn't want to be arrested because he had other things he wanted to do, but it wasn't really of great concern to him.
The 23-year-old was sentenced to serve 20 to 40 years at the Jackson State Penitentiary in southern Michigan.
Behind bars, Henry Lee Lucas twice attempted suicide, was transferred to a mental hospital, and after serving 10 years of his term, was paroled. He was soon back in prison for the attempted kidnapping of 2 teenage girls. After his release for that crime, Lucas became a drifter. But the world would soon come to regard him as something else, a monstrous serial killer who confessed, or rather bragged, that he had murdered hundreds of people. The world would pay considerably less attention as the Lucas story unraveled. What emerged was arguably one of the most elaborate con games in the history of American justice.
In August 1975, 39-year-old Henry Lee Lucas was released from Jackson State Prison in Michigan. But soon, 2 more murders would be pinned on him. Lucas spent the next several years wandering from town to town. In February 1979, the one-eyed drifter ended up in Jacksonville, Florida. There, he met a pyromaniac and occasional transvestite named Otis Toole, who would later play a fateful role in the Lucas saga. Toole and Lucas became friends, and according to Toole, lovers. Henry moved in with Otis and his mother, and grew close to Otis's teenage niece, Becky Powell.
Becky apparently was mildly mentally retarded, and in her eyes he was somebody important, and I think that weighed very heavily on Henry and made a big difference in the way he looked at her.
In 1981, Toole's mother died, and Henry and Otis had to move out of the house. Along with Becky and her brother, they began roaming the interstates. Eventually, Henry and Otis grew apart and split up. Lucas took Becky with him and headed west. In May 1982, the pair ended up in Ringgold, Texas, near the Oklahoma border, living with an 82-year-old woman named Kate Rich. But other members of the Rich family became immediately suspicious and kicked them out. Henry and Becky were back on the road. Then someone took pity on them.
Reuben Moore came across a pair of them. Reuben was a roofer by trade, and he was also a part-time minister. He offered Henry and Becky a place to stay for the night and a meal.
Moore brought them to his Stoneburg, Texas house of prayer, an abandoned chicken ranch, converted to ramshackle living quarters for drifters, and lost souls. There they settled, passing themselves off as husband and wife.
That was the best part of my life. I built my own apartment there, and I worked as a roofer on Moore's roofing crew. I bought a car and had a furniture, what I could buy for the house, had TV and stuff like that.
But Becky was homesick and wanted to go back to Florida. So on August 23rd, 1982, Henry and Becky left the House of Prayer.
Well, they left here and went to the truck stop, and that's the last time we saw Becky. And Henry come back the next evening and was crying and said Becky got in a truck with a truck driver and run off and left him.
A month went by with no word from the girl. By this point, Kate Rich was also missing. The Montague County Sheriff's Office started an investigation into the disappearance of Mrs. Rich. Since Lucas had been living with the woman and had a criminal record, he was a strong suspect, but he denied knowing anything about it. Then, in June 1983, police arrested Lucas on a weapons charge. He was thrown in the Montague County Jail.
Henry, unfortunately for himself, had two Achilles heels. One was cigarettes and the other one was coffee. After 5 days with no cigarettes and coffee, Henry was ready to give them anything they wanted.
Lucas passed a note to the jailer. It read, quote, "I, Henry Lee Lucas, to try and clear this matter up, I killed Kate Rich." Unexpectedly, Lucas also confessed to killing Becky, who was still thought to be alive. In his statement about Mrs. Rich, Lucas said he had picked her up to go to church, but instead drove her around aimlessly.
And then he was taking her home, and he got the urge to kill her and have sex. So he whipped over the railroad tracks and in an oil field road there and stabbed her. And then drug her down a pretty steep embankment and undressed her and had sex with her, and then stuffed her in a cupboard that was right there. And then he thought that we figured out where the body was. So he brought her back to the apartment, put her in the stove there, and burned her over a several-day period of time.
At the House of Prayer, investigators found the wood-burning stove. Inside and on the ground nearby, they found bone fragments and ashes. The crime lab ruled that the remains found in the stove were those of an adult human. The physical evidence at the murder scene also corroborated Lucas's story.
We found some articles of clothing that the daughters identified as being Kate's. Plus, up in the roadway, we found parts that was her glasses. All that was left was the frame, but it was the same color and the same temple length as hers.
Not only that, witnesses had seen Lucas and Mrs. Rich together on the day she disappeared. He was charged with first-degree murder. Lucas said he was also the key to Becky Powell's disappearance. On videotape, he said that on August 23rd, he and Becky had started hitchhiking, but they began arguing. Becky wanted to go back to Jacksonville. Henry couldn't go because there was an outstanding warrant for his arrest there for stealing the truck. When they got to the nearby town of Denton, they saw an empty field off the road and decided to sleep there for the night.
So we went back first to that little tree over there as you go off in the road. And we kept arguing and cussing each other. And she hauled off, hit me upside the head, and that was it. That's when I hit her with a knife. I didn't do it because I didn't love her or anything like that. It was because of arguments and because of difficulties that I've been having through my life.
Lucas led investigators to Becky's remains.
Henry took us straight to a clump of trees and pointed to the ground and said, "You'll find part of her buried in a pillowcase."
Just as Lucas had claimed, investigators soon found human bones buried in a pillowcase. Other remains were found scattered in the field. The skeletal remains were identified as those of a white girl of the same age, height, and weight as Becky. Investigators were convinced that it was Becky Powell. Lucas was again charged with murder. In hindsight, Reverend Moore said he had seen signs Lucas was struggling with a dark secret.
I feel like he had a kind of a dual personality, and I knew he had something bad on his mind, but I couldn't tell what it was. But normally he was just real nice and a jolly type of person.
In early November 1983, Lucas went on trial for the murder of Becky Powell. The defense arguments were similar to those presented at Lucas's trial for the murder of his mother. Again, the defense argued the killing was unintentional.
Becky had never struck Henry in the past. He said that when she slapped him, it made him very angry, and he hit her with a knife before he had time to think.
Walked up to the door.
This time, Lucas seemed truly remorseful. He sobbed, saying he loved Becky and didn't want her dead.
When he cried over Becky Powell, it was something that he couldn't control, and it was genuine. Henry told me that he had killed the only person that really ever meant anything to him.
But the defense faced a major obstacle, Lucas's videotaped confession, in which he exposed the most gruesome details of the crime.
I had sexual intercourse. It's one of those things that I guess has got to be a part of my life. Having sexual intercourse with the dead. Okay.
After deliberating for less than 2 hours, jurors returned their verdict.
The jury found the defendant Henry Lee Lucas guilty of the offense of murder as alleged in the indictment.
Lucas received the stiffest possible sentence, life in prison. Lucas acted more like a man who had won a trial than someone who had lost it.
He got up and shook hands with the prosecutor and said, "You did a good job." So I sort of went blank after that, I believe. I never had a client to do it before or since.
Lucas had his attorney read a statement to the press, which confirmed he got what he wanted.
I do not wish to win because I was responsible for taking Becky's life. I have already gave myself death, so whatever they do, whatever they give me doesn't matter.
Lucas began confessing to other murders all around the country. His confessions included more details about dismemberment, necrophilia, even cannibalism. Detectives and reporters would soon line up to interview Lucas, and he was only too willing to oblige.
Life in the rural Texas town of Montague is normally slow and quiet. But that was before Henry Lee Lucas arrived. In June 1983, 5 months before the Becky Powell trial, Lucas had walked to the Montague courthouse to be arraigned for the Kate Rich murder. In court, he dropped a bombshell.
The judge asked him if he understood the charge. Henry said he did understand it, and he was in fact guilty not only of Kate Rich's murder, but that he had murdered 100 women.
The next day, the story was front-page news. Lucas eventually drew a sentence of 75 years for the Kate Rich murder. But it was his claim of killing 100 others that soon had the national media swarming over Montague. The county sheriff's office was also deluged with calls from police all over the country who hoped Lucas could clear unsolved murders on their books.
It was just overwhelming. We were sending him fingerprints and hair samples and saliva samples to people all over the United States. At one time there, we run out of pubic hair to get from Henry to send people.
Lucas gave a list of 77 women he claimed to have killed in 19 different states. The descriptions, accompanied by childlike sketches of the victims, read like this: New York, near Canada, black hair, was very pretty, would have been stabbed and sex assaulted. Lucas said he picked up most of his victims along the interstates, luring them with offers of dinner or a drink. and then killing them.
Just about everyone I pick up, I kill them. That's the way it's always turned out.
Why is that, Ed?
Sex, to me, a live woman ain't nothing. I enjoy dead sex more than I do live sex.
From the start, some investigators were skeptical of Lucas's claims. His confessions depicted a brutality that was hard even to imagine.
Well, I tell you, cut the woman's head off, so it wouldn't leave no evidence.
According to Lucas, his old friend Otis Toole was an accomplice in many of his highway killings.
Did y'all have sex with the body?
I just did at the time,
Before or after the head was cut?
I had it before and I'd have had it after.
Although at times Lucas's claims seemed incredible, his vivid, detailed statements often fit the known facts of a case reasonably well. And his alleged accomplice, Toole, who was doing time in a Florida prison for arson, readily backed up Lucas's claims.
We picked up lots of hitchhikers and all, Henry mostly killed all the women, himself, Some of them would be shot in the head, in the chest, and some of them would be choked to death, and some of them would be beat it in the head with a tire tool.
That guy was dumb. I asked Otis, I said, how'd y'all cross the country so much, And he smiled out his snaggle teeth and said, when I dress up like a woman, I can get plenty of rides, and he's 6 foot something, and was an ugly man and would have made a very ugly woman.
Henry's own estimate of his victims soon grew to more than 150. In the fall of 1983, investigators from 19 states gathered in Louisiana to swap information on Lucas and Toole.
One FBI agent said that it resembled a cattle auction. Every time some fact was brought up about Henry, the crowd would go wild and start waving their arms and screaming out that, this sounds like something from a case I have.
At the end of the sessions, lawmen linked the two men to 81 murders. Case after case was closed, and the charges against Lucas kept piling up. One of the counts he faced came in the so-called Orange Socks case, the murder of an unidentified woman found in a culvert clad only in a pair of orange socks. In late November 1983, Jim Boutwell, the sheriff of Williamson County in central Texas, brought Lucas to his jail to await trial for the capital crime. The sheriff thought Lucas might also hold the key to a string of unsolved murders along a stretch of I-35. According to Lucas, Boutwell made sure to keep him happy.
He treated me as a son. He bought me anything I would want. If I wanted a sandwich, I got it. If I wanted a steak, I got it, Didn't matter. I lived better in jail than I lived on the street,
Lucas now led an entourage of lawmen and reporters to crime scenes around the country. No physical evidence linked him to the crimes, but he seemed able to identify known murder scenes and to give police details they said only the killer could know.
I flew out to Louisiana, and I had one of the biggest motorcades you ever seen in your life. I had about 500 police cars and motorcycles and everything else taking me to jail.
By this time, Lucas was a criminal celebrity. In interviews, he seemed to brag about his crimes.
Well, I've killed by strangulation, I've killed by knifings, I've killed by hit and runs, shootings, robberies, hangings, every type of crime, I've done it. I've got more female population hating my guts than any place on the earth.
As his notoriety grew, so did the number of victims he claimed. Now, 360. And his confessions only grew more outrageous. The drifter now claimed that he and Otis killed because they had been recruited by a devil-worshipping cult called the Hands of Death. Lucas said that the cult practiced human sacrifices.
They take a live girl and put her on the table and split her open. Take all of her organs out and stuff, and take the body and cremate the body.
What did they do with the organs?
Bury them, or sometimes they put them in a pot and cook them.
Toole never failed to back even the most outrageous statements. And in a taped phone interview with Lucas, he went so far as to claim cannibalism.
And you know, one time you away from their bodies and I did too.
Yeah, I know.
That cutting up like meat, you know.
Well, I've seen bodies cut up worse than you've ever seen a body cut up.
Tastes like real meat when it got barbecue sauce on it, don't it?
Well,
they tried to outdo the other in making their crime they confessed to more horrendous than the one that the other person confessed to, you know, which certainly lowered the credibility of each one of them.
While officials were skeptical about the claims of cannibalism or devil worship, they clearly thought Lucas was a prolific serial killer. By the spring of 1984, his confessions had closed over 100 murder cases.
So far, few were publicly questioning the Lucas confessions. He was happy to lead investigators to crime scenes and, with apparent accuracy, verify his stories. But soon the Lucas legend would be exposed as a hoax.
San Angelo, Texas, April 2nd, 1984. The infamous Henry Lee Lucas now faced his third murder trial. His stay in Williamson County Jail had agreed with him. Entering the courthouse in a suit, he was well-groomed and noticeably heavier than before. Lucas was being tried for the murder of the unidentified woman, known only as Orange Socks. She had been strangled on Halloween night, 1979. Her body dumped in a culvert off I-35 near Georgetown, Texas. The stakes were high this time. Lucas was facing the death penalty on the charge of murder aggravated by rape. There was no physical evidence linking him to the crime, but as in so many other cases, Lucas had confessed.
Well, after I pulled over, I grabbed her by the neck and choked her until she died.
Although he had recanted before the trial, the defendant nevertheless said he wanted the death penalty.
Would you like the death penalty if you are convicted?
I'm going to get it.
Henry's motives never made a lot of sense. How he arrived at what he thought he wanted at any given point in time is beyond human comprehension.
Despite their client's death wish, his attorneys mounted an aggressive defense based on an alibi.
At the time of the alleged murder of Orange Socks, Lucas was working on the roof of the Naval Air Station in Jacksonville, Florida. We got the work records that put him there at that time in Jacksonville.
The prosecutors used Lucas's own words to challenge the records. They played an audio tape of the defendant explaining to the sheriff how he paid off the foreman at the roofing company.
Those work records aren't the true work records. We pay him to show that we were on this job, and we would be gone somewhere else.
The defense argued Lucas had lied about paying off the foreman in order to please Sheriff Boutwell, and that such a payoff was implausible in this case.
They were working for a federal entity at that Naval Air Station. There was a bonus if you completed your work quickly. The foreman would be financially better off completing the job, getting the bonus, than to take some paltry few dollars that Lucas could have afforded to have paid him.
A paycheck cashed by Lucas in Jacksonville the day after the murder posed a bigger challenge to the prosecution. In fact, Their own experts concluded the signature on the check matched Lucas's handwriting.
I would say Lucas got back to Jacksonville in time to pick up his paycheck, or at least get a hold of his paycheck, and in fact did endorse it. And there certainly was time for him to have committed this murder and drive back to Jacksonville to do that.
It's approximately 12 to 1,300 miles between Williamson County, Texas, and Jacksonville, Florida. He would have had to have averaged approximately 70 miles per hour the entire way. That means no stops, and it's nearly impossible.
Riveted the jury when it played Lucas's taped confessions. Lucas said he remembered picking the girl up in Oklahoma City and heading south towards Texas.
We were talking about sex, and she told me not right now. So she went to jump out of the car, which I grabbed and pulled her back in the car. She was fighting so hard I almost lost control of the front wreck. I pulled over, I grabbed her by the neck and choked her until she died. And I had sex with her again.
Then Lucas said he drove all the way to Georgetown, Texas, with the dead woman in the back seat.
Pulled over this way, on down here, drop that over there. Just stop. No clothing.
The prosecution argued that the confession included facts of the crime only the killer would know.
Lucas was able to point out the culvert where the body was found, confirm the manner the girl was killed. There was a matchbook cover that was found near her body from a motel in Henrietta, Oklahoma on I-40, which coincidentally is where Lucas said he picked the girl up.
But the defense maintained that Lucas was fed these details by investigators and that he wove the facts into a false and improbable story.
He drove her, according to his story, from approximately the Oklahoma-Texas border to Williamson County, Texas, some 300 miles, roughly, to just so he could deposit her in a culvert in this county, so he could immediately go back to Jacksonville, Florida. Why not just go back from up there? It's a lot closer.
Lucas's attorneys also pointed out that the defendant did not know many key facts of the crime in his first taped confession.
Each time, Mr. Boutwell, the sheriff, would give him another chance. He'd say, well, now, Henry, are you sure about that? He knows he's wrong. So then he said, well, no, maybe I strangled her. Well, if that didn't work, he'd say, well, maybe I hit her in the head with, something. It was the worst confession.
To see if you can remember where you picked her up hitchhiking.
Well, it was on 35, I'm pretty sure. Yeah, 35.
What state?
In Texas.
No, that's not what you told me before.
Oh, I'm thinking.
Well, you told me before it was Oklahoma City.
Yeah.
The prosecution countered that if Lucas was confused about the Orange Socks case, it was only because he had killed so many others. In the end, Lucas's confession was enough to convince the jury.
Guilty.
They found him guilty of murder and decided that he should die by lethal injection. Defense attorney Don Higginbotham was outraged, believing the jury wrongly convicted Lucas based on his reputation.
Anybody that sat on a jury had been bombarded with press stories. I do believe that the jury, after a while, started thinking, well, I'm not certain whether or not Lucas did this particular case, but I think he's done all these others, so this one, it doesn't really matter whether he did this one or not.
Though Lucas had recanted the confession that earned him the death sentence, he kept confessing to scores of other murders. As a result, after the trial, Lucas went not to death row, but back to his comfortable cell at the task force headquarters. Then he pleaded guilty and was convicted of 7 more murders. But the myth of the serial killer was about to unravel. On April 14, 1985, the Dallas Times-Herald ran a front-page story revealing that Lucas couldn't possibly have committed many of the crimes he had confessed to because he was hundreds, sometimes thousands of miles away at the time of the killings. One of the reporters who wrote the article, Hugh Ainsworth, had met with Lucas regularly since 1983. He said the supposed serial killer told him that he had killed 3 people: his mother, Becky Powell, and Kate Rich, but that all his other confessions were false. Lucas told the reporter the hoax was his way of getting back at law enforcement.
He said, I'm just trying to embarrass law enforcement because of the way they've treated me. They'd never treated him worth a darn, and he had this terrible inferiority complex. He said, they think I'm stupid. When all this is over, they'll know who's really stupid.
According to Lucas, overzealous investigators and the Texas Rangers fed him the information he used to fabricate his confessions.
I'd go through files, all the synopsis reports of murders, how they were murdered, every detail of murder. I'd look at pictures, I'd look at everything, you know, that concerned that murder. And when the detective come from that state or that town or something to talk to me, I know all about the murder, you know. I'd only give them bits and pieces of that crime, you know, yet they didn't care. You know, they wanted it solved.
Lucas also claimed police made it easy for him to discover crime scenes.
They'd ask me to go with them to a crime scene. So they would go out driving, you know, and I would be looking for the house or a number or something like that that I had seen in these pictures. And it might take me 3 or 4 times around the block before I'd point it out to them. I said, yeah, that's it up there, you know. And I told them about the murder that happened there. And that's the way they solved the crimes.
The Dallas Times-Herald expose caused a firestorm in Texas law enforcement as investigators considered whether the man they had labeled the worst serial killer in history was in fact a con artist. Waco, Texas was the setting for the next chapter of the Lucas saga. In mid-April 1985, as the media expose broke, the Waco DA became concerned that law enforcement had been too ready to pin unsolved crimes on Lucas. He called a grand jury to investigate 3 murders Lucas had confessed to. Suddenly, Lucas changed his story.
Finally, they subpoenaed me to come there. And I told him just like it was, you know. I didn't do them.
Lucas recanted all but one of his confessions, that to the murder of his mother. The grand jury cleared Lucas of the 3 murders, but with the Orange Sox conviction still intact, the 49-year-old was now sent to death row in Huntsville, Texas. Texas Attorney General Jim Maddox, who had his own doubts on the Lucas affair, decided to take a closer look into the validity of Lucas's claims and the methods used to interrogate him.
I think it's unlikely that Lucas has committed all the murders that he has confessed to. They have accepted about 210. I think there are a number of those that he did not commit.
The Attorney General's report noted that Lucas had never led authorities to the body of any victim, except in the Becky Powell and Kate Rich cases. The report concluded that investigators had fed Lucas information he used to build his confessions, and that some officials cleared cases just to get them off their books. The report also criticized the task force for not doing anything to bring an end to the Lucas affair, as evidence of a hoax mounted.
It wasn't like that we were drinking in everything that Lucas said and taking it face value. We would only believe what Lucas could prove to us. We were looking for the truth because we knew that there were some people that Lucas had killed.
Despite the controversy, the task force maintained that Lucas was a prolific serial killer.
I don't think it's a hoax. We don't know till this day how many people Lucas really killed. But I think Lucas killed a lot of folks. I think he's very capable of having killed a lot of folks. If he killed his mother and he killed his girlfriend and he killed a lady up there in Ringgold, Texas, burned her in a stove, I mean, where would he stop? Where would he stop killing?
More than a decade has passed since the Lucas task force was shut down. And many still wonder, if Lucas was not a serial killer, how could he have conned investigators time after time? According to some, Lucas had an uncanny memory for details. He had also learned how to manipulate investigators.
Once you ask him about a murder, you have to give him a certain location. And if you don't watch out, Henry will have you telling him how it happened, when it happened, and where it happened, and he'll repeat it back to you. He was a nightmare as far as investigators go because he was so street savvy, it's unreal.
Another puzzle is why Lucas would offer confessions to crimes he didn't commit. Sheriff Phil Ryan thinks his initial confessions to Becky Powell and Kate Rich were sincere, but that later on, his claims were intended to confuse law enforcement.
I think that right behind that, he thought, click, uh-oh, what have I done? You know, I'm going to be locked up, so I'm going to muddy the waters up with all these other confessions.
Others think Lucas was seduced by all the attention he was receiving for the first time in his life and his comfortable existence at the Williamson County Jail.
I don't think Henry wanted to give up a lot of things he had. See, they got to where Henry didn't have to wear any prison clothes. They gave him all the artistic material he wanted, all the cigarettes he wanted, cable TV in his cell. As Henry had stated to me, I was living like a king. He said, why did I want to change that? And they told him, the instant you stop confessing, you're going to death row.
But in the end, it was his confessions which brought him to death row and will now cost him his life. And though it is widely believed Lucas did kill at least 3 people, Texas plans to execute him for a crime he most likely did not commit. The Attorney General's report cast doubt on the orange socks conviction.
They did a lie detector test on Henry, which came to the conclusion that Henry did not kill Orange Socks and that he was in Florida on the night that Orange Socks was killed.
In its appeals, the defense also emphasized other inconsistencies.
This case was a rape within a murder. Well, when the pathologist did the autopsy on this woman, he could find no forensic findings at all that she had been raped whatsoever. He also found the fact that she had an advanced case of syphilis. Henry has never been diagnosed with venereal disease.
Nonetheless, Lucas's death sentence was upheld, and his execution was set for June 30th, 1998. But with just 4 days to go, his life was spared when then Texas Governor George W. Bush commuted his sentence to life in prison, making Lucas the only death row inmate to receive clemency from Governor Bush. Death is what Lucas said he wanted during his trial, but he later changed his mind. Defiant to the end, he died in Huntsville in March 2001 at the age of 64.
I don't want to die, you know. I don't want to be executed for something I didn't do, you know. I'm going to keep on fighting. It's not over until God says it's over, you know.
In 1998, days before he was to receive a lethal injection, Henry Lee Lucas became the only prisoner on death row in Texas to be granted clemency by then-Governor George W. Bush. Bush commuted his death sentence in the orange sock slaying to life without parole. In March 2001, Lucas died of heart failure in a Texas prison infirmary. Many still believe that Lucas could not have committed most of the crimes he confessed to. That, of course, leaves a disturbing issue unresolved. If many of his confessions were false, then dozens of killers have escaped justice. For American Justice, I'm Bill Curtis.